Good morning, everyone. Good morning, historians. It's Thursday, January 18th. I hope you're keeping safe and warm in the storm conditions that we're facing here in Portland and Oregon. As promised, I planned some remarks to support your learning and your writing in our class, History 491, 591. As I noted on Tuesday, this recording will be available as a fully loaded lecture with slides, and I'll also upload the audio and the slides separately if you prefer to review the material in that fashion. So the idea here is to give you some little extra support. Your first paper is due tonight at midnight if you're able to wangle that with electricity and etc. It's not cheating to have the support from class. We were intending to do a paper exchange of drafts and deeper discussion. So this is a sort of near beer, if you will, to support your learning as we build our vocabulary, continue to build our foundations for the practice of women's and gender history. That'll continue next week. So we have 2 articles for Tuesday, and then we'll get into our first sort of full-blown biography by Thursday. So stay tuned. What I'll do now is I'll do a quick share screen and walk you through some remarks that I have today on the reading. I hope you can see this all okay. So notes on biography, where this is part of our intellectual adventure this term. We are thinking about sort of lives and storytelling as a important feature in the firmament, if you will, of scholarship on women and gender. And so I have a little overview here. So I'm going to kind of introduce what I'm calling the problematics of women's biography, particularly as featured in the 3 essays due today. I'll touch on some keywords. I'm not going to walk you through every single one. They'll become, I'll define a few pointedly at key moments in my discussion, but I hope you're keeping a list of vocabulary words because that is part of what you get in studying history in school, right? You get to build a toolbox and with support, from instructors and colleagues. And then I'll just walk us through the 3 essays for the day because I think they do a really great job, hence the reader and its, high status, beloved status in the field of really modeling some of the intellectual moves, if you will, necessary to surface women's stories given colonial and migratory and other kinds of power dynamics in the world, in the modern world. We're sort of post 1750 here. So, and then I'll just have a few thoughts for conclusions. So what do I mean by the problematics of women's biography? Well, if you've looked at the material for today, the authors are quite emphatic that, archives are primarily the institutional records of polities, religious institutions, and corporations. And so when you think of archive, generally, these are the kinds of materials that dominate the research landscape. And generally, women are not found explicitly in those collections because generally women are excluded from official power in these in domains. And so evidence about them can be hard to find. Moreover, so that's the archival side of it. And then the sort of narrative side of it. So one of the problems with doing research on women and gender is archives do not cater explicitly to that problem, that question, right? That rubric. And then on the production side, on the narrative side, the strongest contours of biographical stories, biographies, in the West especially, women don't fit in the dominant narrative arcs, the sort of templates, if you will, for telling a life, which still tends to center on heroic male individuals, particularly those that particularly those that conform to the highest status categories in a given society. In the modern U.S., this usually means quote unquote white, So we have some structural challenges in telling women's stories. So one of the things I want to just remind us is that, again, we're in Unequal Sisters Volume 5, fifth edition, and I've featured in this images on the slide here the accomplishments of an amazing feminist historian named Judy Jung, who sort of went into one of these archives that didn't mean to document issues of women and gender, but that if you read the archive correctly, you can surface an incredible story about women, families, communities, parenting, and politics. So Judy Young tackled the Angel Island Immigration Center, which you see pictured below on the bottom right of the slide, which of course still stands in the San Francisco area and now is a museum and archive. And Jung has read these sort of immigration materials with a very keen and critical eye to really bring back to life the stories, the experiences, the politics, and the advocacy and activism of Chinese and Chinese American women. Remember, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 to 1943, you might say, well, Chinese folks were excluded from immigrating, and so what is the story to be told? Well, I won't spoil it for you. You're going to have to read Jung on your own, but let me tell you, it's an extraordinary scholarly accomplishment. So I just wanted to draw your attention to these earlier traditions, the shoulders, if you will, that our current scholars stand on, people who have read sort of traditional archives, if you will, with a very creative and productive lens. So, so in order to do this work, right, you sort of need special glasses. And there's a bunch of collection of keywords and concepts in this week's reading that provide some lenses, right? Provide some tools to help read a resistant archive, or an archive characterized by blanks or silences or missing information. And so some of these ideas, I'll just tick them off real quick: female consciousness, the gender division of labor, the idea of inter-imperial networks and domains, the idea of holding the line. This comes from the strike labor activism side. The notion of a collective voice. I think it's a wonderful element in Weber. You know, the idea of that lots of folks in our class, I want to find my voice. Well, sometimes the archive doesn't speak in that privileged individual sense. Sometimes people speak as one of a collective. So very interesting. What is a collective voice, right? The idea of reproductive labor, that is the labor that women do to sustain life, generally non-remunerative labor, you know, feeding, clothing, healthcare, tending to children, etc. And then this cognitive move, remember, this is something we emphasized a lot last week, this idea of recentering. I mean, Crenshaw did this, I think, quite beautifully. The idea of that rather than accept the terms that we have in the archives as a given and fixed, to recenter a subjectivity or a set of identifications that can illuminate what's missing, can fill in some of those blanks. So she recenters, quote unquote, Black female experience in order to illuminate the workings of the court that, you know, kept marginalizing, kept deconstructing and pulling apart that identity. So recentering and decentering. So decentering certain forms of subjectivity and recentering alternative forms of identification to read the archive with a different lens. In Roney, we see a feature of this, like the cartographic imagination. So like, even how do we think of place? How do we think of where one is in the world is highly ideologic. It's historical, right? We call this place Portland, Oregon because of colonialism, because of the nation state, because of certain wars. It has many other names, right? You know, delineated and descended from indigenous nomenclature and identification. So I just put Romy's map here to say, what does the world look like? It depends on where you stand and what lens you're looking through. So to bring that critical eye to this sense of place. And all of these kind of formations speak to the relationship between colonial knowledge and colonial ignorance, right? In some ways, I think the land acknowledgements that have become more current in scholarly and political and other kinds of settings are an attempt to, I mean, there's lots we can say about land acknowledgements depending on who's doing them and why, but I think in a very general way, in my experience, they're an attempt to push back against colonial ignorance, right? And to recenter, if you will, alternative histories and expose power relationships where they get hidden. We say, well, welcome to Portland, Oregon. Well, that's just not the whole story. And so some of the ways that some of the vocabulary words that scholars use to describe these sort of marginalized sensibilities, these sort of suppressed or subjugated forms of knowledge is just that. I think that comes out of Foucault. The idea that, polities, corporations, medical establishment, religious institutions create knowledge formations that lift up certain kinds of things and push to the side other sorts of things. And so those other sorts of things don't go away. They exist in the sort of tide pools, in the sort of, sometimes people talk about spaces of abjection, that they are considered abject knowledge, that it's true, but has no political meaning. And we want to be on the alert for that kind of formulation. And also the idea of diaspora, that people, this is again back, not well ordered perhaps, but go back to this notion of mapping and movement and place, that the ideas of citizenship and nationhood are kind of privileged in academic and scholarly and scientific and political discourses, and yet lots of people don't fit in that bucket, right? And lots of people live in diaspora, or they live in both. They live in potentially a citizenship context, but also in a diasporic context. So diasporas are important word. We could do a whole class on the word and its various meanings, but I just thought I'd list these out for you to kind of have them in one spot, sort of one-stop shopping. Okay. So we have great examples. Each of our essays today provides wonderful examples of how different groups and different individual women do not fit the received categories. And so Weber's take on Mexicana farm workers is, case in point. That, sort of the history of capitalism or the history even of colonialism privileges certain kinds of categories, right? Citizenship is privileged in the modern era. The notion of the subaltern, or sort of groups that are explicitly colonized, the notion of being native or indigenous, that's a category that, one can find if you, look, if you look. And also slavery. The institution of slavery is highly articulated in the institution of slavery is highly articulated in the archives, though of course some of the detail about lives and humans and families become subjugated, right? The category slave is visible, but like detail, the rest is inhabits subjugated knowledge. And though she doesn't use this frame, Mexicana, she privileges Mexicana, a kind of more or less nation state oriented category, put that out there provisionally, rather than say migrant workers who operate in diaspora and who are hard to capture and fix in place the way that knowledge systems like to categorize and fix people in place. So Mexicana farm workers, for lots of reasons, do not fit into these received scholarly categories. Oh, also, in history of capitalism, unions, you can find unions, right, in the archives, because unions are political institutions and they keep records. And so unionization is often the first step of writing labor history, right? How do you write labor history? So, well, let's start with unions because there's paperwork, right? There's things to read. And so often women workers are not unionized for lots of different reasons that we'll talk about all term. But just again, that's just one way in which female experience slips around in the archives and is hard to document. And so Weber propounds, and she's hardly alone in this, that one of the ways to correct and compensate the archive is through oral history. So if you're working in a time period where people are still in living memory, have living memory of events, this is one way that feminist scholars have tried to push back, right? And so she identifies, although with a pseudonym, Mrs. Valdez, who has a kind of testimony and story to tell about the 1933 cotton worker strike in the San Joaquin Valley. And there's some very, very interesting things about Mrs. Valdez's voice, which I think we are wise to attend to, and which Weber, I think, describes with great sensitivity. And also with a little poke at us. Translation is, of course, a feature of some of the structuring of knowledge and the privileging of English or the dominant colonial language. And Weber leaves Mrs. Valdez's voice in Spanish in the main text, and you can find the translation in the notes. I don't know if anybody did that or looked or noticed, but maybe Spanish is not a barrier. Maybe folks are bilingual. I'm not with you, so I can't ask you. But anyway, so Mrs. Valdez's voice is left in Spanish as a marker of her reality, her experience, her the tensions between her sensibility and the scholarly agenda, perhaps. And that voice claims a collective voice. Mrs. Valdez generally speaks in we. And so very interesting, right? So we're in a biographical context and in a narrative context where the individual voice is privileged and the individual story is privileged. Mrs. Valdez speaks for a we, which is, I think, important to think about. The other thing that Weber models by reading Mrs. Valdez's testimony is to, again, revalue ideas, concepts, and networks. And so by looking at something that might be ignored as not political or as personal, Weber attends to the importance of food and feeding people and sustaining life in the strike and for Mexicana farm workers, that this is like the currency. This is like the lifeblood that holds the community together. And so there's a recentering, right, or a decentering of official politics, right, and a recentering of reproductive labor, of food provision, of feeding, of mealtime, all of these essential sustaining labors that often go unnoticed, unnamed, and certainly unpaid. So I thought the picture I got from Wikimedia Commons about the strike, I thought this was a very very pertinent image because of the ways that a meal, cooking, and kids, different generations. And I love this young woman in the center, right? Talk about recentering, this young woman standing in the center, kind of quite nicely dressed, wearing earrings, hair combed, perhaps not what you might expect. Speak for myself, perhaps not what I would have expected. I wanted to I was Googling around looking for pictures, with people, women holding signs, etc. That's my agenda, right? And just so this absolutely wonderful correction to my own lenses that I'm bringing to the archive. And I just thought this was a wonderful image. So what Weber documents is the ways, and again, she's hardly alone, certainly important in my own work and many others who have looked at labor conflict in the 20th century with a feminist lens, that it's largely the job of women and children to, quote unquote, hold the line during a strike. This means communications, this means dealing with strike breakers, this means keeping morale up so that the men folk can not be worn down by the company or by the police. And so that women's ability to hold the line, and here's Weber's thesis, that the spread and success of the strikes depended on familial and social networks of Mexican workers as much if not more than the small but effective and ambitious union. So by running the camp kitchen, by pooling childcare, doing healthcare, picketing, distributing clothing, confronting strike breakers, and sometimes participating in meetings and such, that this is the everyday work of holding the line. And it's absolutely essential to the success of that strike and many others, many others. I have also here a wonderful reminder that about a generation later in the 50s, an excellent film was made called The Salt of the Earth, which documented the San Joaquin strike was largely Mexican and Filipino workers, and Salt of the Earth was primarily Mexican and mestizo workers in New Mexico against the Empire Zinc Company. And you can see from the poster that female experience is also centered in or recentered in the story of the Empire Zinc strike. Was a Esperanza, oh gosh, what's Cordero, I think is the last name of the character in the film. And there she is pictured on the poster for the film, which was also suppressed during McCarthyism because of its anti-capitalist and not super sympathetic to communism, but certainly not explicitly anti-communist. So it became very vulnerable, and but nonetheless has been recovered, and an archive exists that you can take a look at too online. I put a link in the slide if you want to look at the online catalog, online archives of California. It's done a very good job in recovering a lot of this labor history. So moving on, similarly, the Roney article does a great job of recentering women's voices, women's stories, and women's memory keeping as providing kind of an alternative, a corrective, an alternative, and a critical view on sort of hidden colonialism. I mean, one of the reasons why Mexicana farm women, one of many reasons, is that they're Mexican nationals, but their heritage is complex. Many claim mixed indigenous ancestry. They're officially not colonized by the United States, but there's certainly folks that aren't welcomed into the United States. So the idea of citizen subaltern doesn't really capture their experience, right? And so too, in Roney's work, it's critical to what she argues is it's critical to recenter stories that don't fit, right? That don't fit the dominant categories of nation state identities, and that can reorient us toward multiple or layered empires, the notion of trans-Pacific family and labor circuits, and this really new word called inter-imperiality, which is like how people live in the betwixt and between spaces between empires. So you can look at an imperial context, and not everybody fits in the citizen versus subaltern category. This is kind of where my piece picks up next week, is that like that binary doesn't even begin to capture, quote unquote, everybody in a particular colonial or imperial context. And I just wanted to bring forward the title of Roney's recent book, The Memory Keepers, Gendered Knowledges, Empires, and Indonesian American History. So what Roney's sort of doing is kind of inventing a new category of history to enter into the scholarly firmament, if you will, Indonesian American history. And he makes visible dynamics, political dynamics, labor dynamics, and dynamics of identification, right? How people know who they are and where they belong, that were not visible before. And her thesis is that memory keeping forges integrative possibility, not only physically across islands, oceans, and continents, but also temporally across decades, empire, and generations. So memory keeping, women's memory keeping, keeping photos, telling stories, visiting, right? It's not just tourism, right? It's visiting ancestral sites, keeping the generations connected, the inheritance of mementos and jewelry and treasured objects. It's going to come up a lot when you read Ty Miles on Ashley Stack. That these are not just, again, decorations. They're not just colorful, as Weber talks about Mexico. This is sort of the emotional side of the story. It's not just that, it's actually a critical intervention into erasure, right? And can be politically decisive, like in a case like a labor strike. So I thought this was really great. I think Roni does a wonderful job of sort of problematizing, the job of the historian, which is sort of, as I think I mentioned week one, is like to sort of make an argument for when things begin and end, or where things begin and end, right? Spatiality being very important here. So Roni problematizes what is here and what is there, right? Well, depends on what lens you're using. And I brought in a little example. She calls this the cartographic imagination. So that helps us think about, like, how do we know where we are? Maps are highly imperial instruments generally. And I put a little image on the screen here, from a company called Ruggable. I just Googled map of the world. So I'm just taking the temperature today, January 18th. And here is a rug that's for sale, a rug that pictures the world where, Indonesia is completely erased. Most of the Pacific is completely erased. And yet this is the world, right? So it's kind of weird to be laughing by myself here at home. But anyway, I hope it's not really funny, but it is instructive, right? That's sort of the release of emotions, like, okay, yeah, this really is still happening. And Roni goes on to suggest that personal archives, like oral narratives, can form a potentially critical oppositional knowledge for the practice of history, especially where women's biography is concerned. So Roni's practice as a scholar, as a biographer of sorts, questions colonial knowledge and surfaces, brings forward colonial ignorance when she asks, why doesn't, quote unquote, anyone know that Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world? Well, good question. I mean, it starts with, like, it's erased out of the map, at least in this one little example I've brought forward. And so for Roni, she attempts to generate a new scholarly category called Indonesian American History, which, again, in so doing, surfaces the ways in which certain social formations like trans-Pacific family kinship networks get erased, and other kinds of kinship networks and family are privileged. So it's not that, here's go back to some of our critical feminist vocabulary. It's not just that Indonesian American women and families are different, right? But rather their circuits through the world, their inhabiting of migrant labor practices, their participation or resistance in colonialism is co-constitutive, right? It's part of the whole understanding of how a social system works. So it's not just different and forgettable, but rather integral to understanding how power and history work over time. And so I love how this essay sort of upends some of the conventions of immigration history. As an immigrant's kid myself, I always notice these things with a special attention, the sort of everyday questions, if you will, about, where are you from, or when did your family get here, kind of thing. Those are questions that, are not necessarily evil or of evil intent, but they privilege a certain kind of narrative, right? Oh, I'm from here, now I live there, or I'm from there, now I live here. And there's lots of people that don't fit that construction, and they don't fit the sort of assimilative, heading towards nation state citizenship, particularly in the United States, kind of narrative, that they live transnational diasporic lives that have just as much to tell us, right, about the history of colonialism, capitalism, empire, and so forth. So that's Roni. And I think, again, the piece works just so well with Materson because the premise of her article is that no one knows where Puerto Rico is. No one, sort of a default US citizen kind of knowledge, nightly news kind of knowledge, I sometimes call it. No one knows where Puerto Rico is or what its status is due to long-standing, oops, little typo, patterns of patching, is the word she uses, the colonial relationship between the US and the island with sort of democratic and citizen-like dynamics. So the constant running of referenda, kind of inch-mealing Puerto Rico toward full citizen and voting rights. It's a long story that I won't go into here, but we can and will going forward. I've also brought forward a little pop culture reference here to West Side Story from the 1950s. The song America says, one lyric is immigrant goes to America, many hellos in America. Nobody knows in America, Puerto Rico's in America. So I don't mean to sing and irritate you, but couldn't resist, particularly since I think Rita Moreno, who's pictured here on the lower left, I believe she just got a Lifetime Recognition Award this summer for her accomplishments in the arts. And as a former New Yorker, I always noticed New Yorkers. So, but more to the point, Ruth Reynolds became a New Yorker, just like Pauli Murray kind of became a New Yorker in the 1930s and 40s. And as a white woman from the Midwest, perhaps ironically or tellingly, also ended up inhabiting or falling into this space of erasure and marginalization. In this case, through her political identification, her political work as a radical critic of colonialism. And so Ruth Reynolds, who like Pauli Murray in the 30s and 40s, was studying nonviolence, fell into an interesting political ferment in New York City, in Harlem, was looking for ways to really become a pacifist, an opponent to war. Met up with, as you know from the piece, Puerto Rican nationalists who were lobbying strenuously and doing activism to foster the independence of Puerto Rico as a nation. And for her activism, Ruth Reynolds, I mean, I can't pull the class because we're not in class, but how many people have heard of Ruth Reynolds? I mean, this is the kind of subjugated knowledge, right, that unfolds in a nationalist context. Reynolds faced government surveillance, jail, and the suppression of her publications and voice. I've put the cover of her book, Campus in Bondage, which was finally published in 1989. I think Manderson does a very succinct job in showing how in the experience of actual people, the privileging of US nation state politics and interests, international interests, global interests, play out in an individual life, right? And that, like the other two essays, like Weber and like Roni, that Reynolds' story really couldn't be told until there was a kind of different archival matrix, if you will. So between Freedom of Information Acts, the establishment of new archives, in point of fact, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College in New York City. I've put the web address on there for you if you'd like to explore a little bit further, but it's not until the knowledge formations shift that permit the challenging of these, colonial, imperial, nationalistic, capitalistic norms can be challenged and can be engaged as such. So, I thought Reynolds did a great. I thought Manderson did a great job, again, very succinctly laying out a life that you might also not have heard of, but for these critical practices by the historian. So here we are back to what we need to do as scholars. So final thoughts. So as we contemplate the power of biography for women and gender issues, we want to acknowledge the extra superpowers, if you will, of research that are often involved. And it's very important to have a crucial eye on what is in the archives and what is not. Since archives, their contents, their accessibility, the language that they're written in, are fundamentally shaped by the power relations of the surrounding context, i.e., imperialism, capitalism, institutional religion, etc. So, in particular, these three essays surface the colonial relations that are elided or coded or shadowed by dominant categories that are pertinent to the, have been pertinent to the story of capitalism, empire, and nation state. So, workers are men in unions, right? So if you want to do women's labor history, you have to challenge that. If you're interested in citizenship categories, well, and if you're looking at a group of folks who was either denied the right to assimilate, the denied naturalization rights, whose agenda was not equality within the United States, but some other kind of maybe radical agenda, you've got your work cut out for you. So I think each of these essays documents the kinds of oppositional discourses by and about women that in turn is surfaced by oppositional archival practices for the historians involved. And some of these, I think, can be reconstituted, right? Creatively reconstituted as biographies, as stories of actual people who did stuff. And so that requires literary as well as research talents. And so as we move forward in our course, we will assess and evaluate how good these stories are, how convincing they are, what are the trade-offs with biography? Do they tell more? Do they tell less? What are some of the archival circumstances that permit good biography or convincing biography, and where are the places that we need more work, or we need to build yet a better rebel archive, to quote Kelly Little Hernandez. So I'll leave it there and wish you well for the day and its challenges with heat, water, electricity, transportation, and so forth. Stay safe, stay dry. And I will look forward to meeting with you next week, fingers crossed, and to reading your papers. If you'd like to send me a draft today, no problem. Happy to get back. I can get it back to you fairly toot sweet. And thanks for hanging in there. And I look forward to reconnecting with you soon. Thanks now.